quickly. When you go to the governor's office and you're talking about disaster, the preparedness that you want to do for your exercise, one of the fundamental questions is, what are you going to prepare for? And who are you going to help prepare for it? And I just want to suggest that the definition is really important in guiding you where you want to go. And this is a definition that, in fact, I think is most helpful when you're looking at a response point of view. And first of all, an emergency is a normative situation in which there's consensus that extraordinary actions are required. That's actions beyond what's currently being taken. Let me just talk about that for a minute. Normative, what does that mean? It means that we as a people together decide what is we consider an emergency or not. There is no absolute physical or otherwise event that will say, now we have an emergency. And why that's really important for you, yes, if you're thinking about a specific event like a typhoon or a tidal wave or something, then it's easier. But when you are sitting in an agency or you're going to the governor's office, and if he's talking about preparing for emergencies, and you say, what emergencies? And then, in fact, the question is, what circumstances of people are so acute that you believe that we together believe that extraordinary action is required? In other words, to call something an emergency is to say, help, let's do something quicker. So it's a call to action. And then the question is, so when I would, and I will tell you about this, when I would do preparedness exercises around the world, so what happened is I would say to an office, tell me what emergencies are going to happen in the next year that you should be prepared for. And I wouldn't say any categories. And some would say earthquakes, everybody agreed. And then they would say, maybe climate change. What about poverty? What about movement? What about displacement? Is displacement an emergency or not if people have to flee from their homes and they don't have it? What if malnutrition and you slowly begin to see children's nutrition going down? When is it an emergency that you think you should tell the governor's office to act on? So in other words, this normative situation is a very important point for you, and it will always generate debate. And I always used to say that in the offices I worked in. They would say, somebody would say, but family violence is such a acute situation, we should call that an emergency. And other people would say, no, we don't want to call that emergency. We want to just stick with earthquakes or something physical. And I would say, that's exactly the debate we should be having as human beings, as humanitarian agencies. And you should be saying, on what criteria, what basis of the human condition will you say is so acute that extraordinary action should be required? Anyway, normatives, consensus. If you think it's an emergency, that is, something should be done, and no one else thinks it's an emergency, nothing will happen. So from a response point of view, it's really important, this consensus issue. And this has a lot to do, if you go to the governor's office and you say, I think we need to be prepared for this, and no one else believes that, then your job is to actually generate that consensus. And that's a whole wonderful dynamic field to talk about. And of course, the extraordinary action. What does extraordinary action mean? Well, it means what you find in emergencies in people is that people in situations, they say, don't worry, I've got it. We're doing it now. We can handle this situation. And over and over and over in all countries, what you find is that sometimes it's necessary for someone to say, no, what you're doing isn't enough. It's not good enough. Are the needs met? Are they met sufficiently? And therefore extraordinary action. And you'll have to wrestle with that issue. Okay, I won't, because of time, I'll be brief here, but let me take it to the next slide. Can you see that one called emergency response considerations? Now, when you go to the governor's office, and if he says to you, well, we have lots of emergencies, and indeed you will. Every agency, every governor, every country has on the left side, you will see over here, many different types of emergencies at the threats at the same time. health crisis, nutrition crisis, you have all kinds of environmental impacts that we talked about, natural disasters, and so forth. This is, the list is long. So then how are you going to prepare? What are you going to say to the governor? How do you approach that one? So if you look at these, as we go along over time, each one of these goes up and down. There's no linear straight line to that the threat is getting bigger. So, it goes up and down. And then you're going to say, well, okay, when do I need to act? What is this preparedness? And secondly, how should I prepare? Should we have a plan for every one of our risks? Or should we buy supplies for and put in place personnel and all kinds of things for everyone? And we might have 20, 30 plans, planning that we're doing if you do it by specific hazard. So that's one of the questions. How do you approach this fact that in any community we have multiple threats? How do you deal with that from a preparedness point of view? Secondly, when it happens, you don't know back here whether it's going to be a massive assistance that's needed, whether you should plan for the worst case. Should we, for example, let me just say, last week we talked with someone who was setting up in Asia, responded to the tsunami way back in 2011, the one in Indonesia that caused global damage. And he said, rightly, when everyone said, tsunami happened, we have to put in place a tsunami early warning system. And he said, tsunamis happen in Asia in this this category once every 500 years. Are you going to put in place a system, preparedness system, and a warning system for something that's going to happen one every 500 years? So I'm not sure that's a very workable solution. Or is the emergency going to require some assistance or local? Is it going to be sufficient? So you're going to have to say, on what basis do I plan when I don't know the nature of the emergency threats here? Let me just look at these other parts. Remember that early warning as a part of fits in this ongoing process. Prevention is an ongoing issue. Risk reduction is an ongoing concern. How do we reduce the damages? And then, of course, the preparedness, which continues to go along. And this includes both the humanitarian and the business continuity, and then, of course, transition. So let's just say we're not going to solve these today and get into the details of this. But to me, what has come out of this for me is, first of all, is that in your consideration for the governor's office, you will want to look at something called this, which we have labeled standard level of preparedness. What's the minimum essential preparedness that you want to hold at your community level or your state level or your national level? And, to deal with these multiple hazards that might happen. And the general field, and you hear this, all the time, is the need for a multi-hazard approach to this. So you need to do, and then that's one. Secondly, the contingency planning. When do you plan specifically for each emergency? And there's some ideas about that. That is to say, no, you can't do that for every threat that you have. At least that is active contingency planning. Most agencies, most communities don't have the time, money, or resources to do very specific contingency planning like the military does. And even though the military does it, even they don't get it right in many cases, it's clear. So then the question of how you deal with the worst case, there's one idea that says, if we deal with the worst case, then we will it'll take care of all these others, the less likely. And in fact, it doesn't actually work like that in practice. No community or family can actually buy supplies and deal with the worst case. So you have to actually do the planning for some of these things, do the preparedness for another. Again, we're not solving these today. I'm raising these for your exercise in the hopes that it's useful for you to think about this and maybe even confuse you. Now let me stop the share and go back and just talk with you a little bit. So that's the kind of, so what happened to me was this. After the Ethiopia case, I was in Rwanda at the time of the genocide, or right after the genocide, right in the period that was ending, and was working on the case of unaccompanied children and how to return them to their families. But there was one situation there where hundreds of thousands of people had fled Rwanda to the neighboring, across the border on foot. And so we got the message that these hundreds of thousands of people were going to come back. They're going to be walking back to Rwanda, hundreds of thousands. And somebody in the office, the head of the office, said, Everett, could you help the office prepare for this? And I said, yes, I've had a little preparedness experience, and whatever, I'll do what I can. And what I drew on was this. Some years before, I had gone to Sri Lanka, which had been ravaged by a cyclone. And then, of course, after the cyclone, the government and UN agencies said, we need to have a preparedness plan. So I had helped the government draw up their preparedness plan. And so I went to interview all of the same people that Enzo talked about, that is the village, the local level people, the provincial level, and the headquarters. And one of the things that I found was that each of them had an important role to play, but each of them didn't understand the rest of the group. So when I talked with the local level, they said, and I think you're going to find the same thing when you do your exercise here in the US or anywhere else, and you find the local people said, it's we who did the response. The authorities, they're hopeless. They provided very little. And then the local level government said, we are the ones who managed it. The provincial level authorities, we hardly heard from them. And then you went to the provincial level and they said the same about the central government. In fact, every one of them played a critical role, but they didn't understand the roles of the others. So part of your preparedness exercise when you do that is going to try to bring in harmony these different levels and help them understand. So with these two principles, one is everybody has a role. And secondly, we need to help bring together harmony between these different actions. So in the case of Rwanda, I helped them facilitate a participatory process. I happen to really believe in that, in this participatory process. And then what happened after that is that I was made an emergency officer for UNICEF, a regional one, and I had to cover 23 countries of Southern and Eastern Africa to help them prepare and respond to emergencies. What a fantastic job. I had the best job in the whole organization. And so what I did was, I'll tell you why it's so exciting. And this has to do with what your role is, how you see your role in preparedness, because there are many roles in preparedness and many types of preparedness. So you can choose the one that fits your interests and your skills. But for me, in working at this level, where my job was to help an office and all the people in the office be prepared, it was a fantastic thing because I didn't have to decide who was in what position or what anything. I had only one job, and that is, I want to help you be better prepared for whatever you want to do, whatever you think you should do. So we use this, so I innovated this preparedness process in which I could go to a country office, and I would never do it if the top person didn't participate and support it. So remember, if the governor is not involved, if the governor doesn't believe in it, don't even try. You have to, whoever the head of the agency or head of that you're working with, you have to have that support or it's not worth it. But I would go to an office and they would say, okay, Everett, you come and help us. And I just very quickly, the process that I would use to follow those two principles, we'd get everybody in the whole office together. Everyone. And in 1 hour, we would say, what emergencies are going to happen in the next year that you think you should be prepared? And we had the debate that I would talk about. And then I would put up a chart and say, okay, 2-hour blocks for the whole office. Choose the one that's most convenient so we don't disrupt the office. And people would put down a 2-hour block when they would like to work with me on this thing. And then I would go in that 2-hour block with a projector and I would put on the board and I would say, what is your job? And we, first of all, let me say, we would always do it in units. And that includes the finance people, the operations people, the nutrition people, the executive himself, and so forth, everyone, and say to them, and each one team independently, and then say, what is your job? What are your tasks? And what will you do in an emergency if this emergency happens? And what should you do could you do to prepare for it? And we would go down through every function and say, what could you do to prepare for it? And then after everybody in the office went through that process and we had this, as soon as it was finished, that little exercise, it's quick, remember, 2 hours, and I would hand them what they produced and said, this doesn't have my name on, this is not me, these are your words, change it if you want to, this is yours. And then we would bring it together and you had a plan for the whole office. And we would sit around the office, sit around the table, and we would say, and I would always start with the head of the office, and I would say, would you read what you're going to do in an emergency? And he would say, and he would read it. And then I would say to the rest of the team, do you think he's doing the right things? And it would always gender a discussion. And we did that with everyone. And in every case, and I facilitated this myself in 50 country offices, 50 different countries. And in every case, everyone said, but this is so helpful. And in every case, I would say, why? And in every case, they said, because it helps me think through what I need to do. And that to me is the essence of preparedness. It's about people. Most of all, it's about people. There are systems, there are manuals, but now there are manuals on everything, millions of manuals. And you can't even, you're killed by the manuals. You still need them. But it's about people. We're losing sight with internets and all the rest of the people element of this thing. I just wanted to tell you one more story about that. So I went to one of the deputy executive directors of UNICEF at the very top, that is, and I went up to the 13th floor and I said to her, would you like to know what I'm doing with regard to preparedness around the world? Because I learned if you want to change a system, start at the bottom. Don't start at the top. Start with people who want to do it, you prove it, you prove it, you do it, you do it, you do it. And finally, I said to her, would you like to know what I'm doing with all the offices and your own office? And she said, yes. And I said, would you give me an hour of your time and we'll do it? And she said, okay. And so I went up to the 13th floor just with the executive director and I put up the projector just like I did everybody else. And I said, what are your functions? And what will you do in an emergency? And then we thought through and what she should do to prepare for her role at the top, the senior executive. And she said, but this is really helpful. And I said, but why? And she said, because it helps me think through what I need to do. 1 year later, she called me and said, Everett, could you come back and do that exercise again? Because some of my functions have changed and I want to think through what I should do. So as you can see, I'm passionate about preparedness because I think it can make a difference. There's no more fun in work than preparedness because you get to deal with everything. If you want to make something, an office or a state or whatever work, you have to have the whole thing has to work together. And therefore you really have a potential, if you're curious, if you like diversity, if you like many things, and if you like people, because it's a people job, then you will want to do something like this. So anyway, I want to flip my screen again if I can make it happen. And I want to show you one of the big challenges in this. Two, I've called them devils. Let me get this screen here. Can you see that? Do you see challenging devils? All right, there's two challenging devils in preparedness that I would note today. And one is words and paper without action. So you get many people who do plans and it stays there and it has almost no consequence. And you've heard, I'm sure Diego and others have cited, General Eisenhower or whatever from World War II, who said, I've always found plans to be useless, but planning indispensable. So any case, but if you do words and paper without action, and let's just say a couple of weeks ago, I talked with emergency officers in Syria about emergency preparedness planning. And they said, what good is the planning if there's no supplies in the warehouse? So obviously it has to do with action. The second one is sustainability. And that is when you go to the governor's office and you said, I have a better idea, we're going to do preparedness training or some such activity. It's great, but the challenge is that you have to do it over and over and over and over, because next year new people are there and the situation is different, and you have to do it again and again and again. And that people wear out. They say, oh my God, do we have to do this again? I can't stand the thought of doing this again. You have to do it. And let's just say we don't have time, but an exercise that I love to do is to do that of the airline pilot, who no matter how much he is trained and he's flown 50,000 hours and every year they check him to make sure he knows all the procedures. And when he starts the airplane, he has a checklist and he has to go through it and he has to do these preparedness activities like that. So I don't know if this is going to help you in your exercise with the governor, but these are something that I hope confuses you and makes you uncomfortable, and see if you can correct and challenge and make the world a better place.